Imagine a sunrise in the year 1250. Inside a smoke-filled cottage, a weary laborer sits with his young daughter at a heavy oak table. They aren't drinking water to start their day. Instead, they are dipping hard crusts of bread into large wooden tankards filled with dark, murky beer. Even the child gulps it down before heading out to the fields. In the Middle Ages, drinking raw water was a literal gamble with death, but this small beer was their shield. But here's the strange part. People didn't know about germs. They just knew the beer didn't make them sick. The fermentation process killed the invisible killers in the water. And then it gets worse for those stuck in the city. A merchant walks through a muddy street, stepping over open sewers and rotting trash. He doesn't hold his breath. Instead, he pulls a vinegar-soaked sponge from a tin box and presses it firmly against his face. He believes the sharp sting of the vinegar stops bad air from entering his lungs and rotting his insides. But what happened next on a battlefield was even more unexpected. A surgeon stands over a wounded soldier, but he doesn't reach for water to clean the deep gash. He grabs a flask of sour red wine and pours it directly into the open wound. The soldier screams as the alcohol burns the flesh, but that sting is actually saving his life by killing the infection that water would have only made worse. Further away in a quiet monastery, a monk is performing a different kind of magic. He pours cloudy, brown river water into a porous clay urn. He waits patiently as clear, sparkling droplets slowly leak through the stone and drip into a clean basin below. While the peasants drink beer, the monks are using the earth itself to trap the filth. But the rich had a different secret. A noblewoman prepares for a long journey by dropping a single silver coin into her metal canteen. She knows that water stays fresh for weeks when it touches the silver, though she has no idea why. For those who couldn't afford silver, the trick was in the garden. A village woman slices a jagged, pungent horseradish root and tosses the pieces into a bucket of stagnant pond water. The spicy root leaches out chemicals that purge the water, making a drink that bites back, but keeps the village alive. Imagine a medieval merchant draped in heavy wool, stepping carefully through a narrow city street. The ground beneath his boots is a thick slurry of mud, animal waste, and rotting kitchen refuse. Instead of holding his breath, he reaches into a small tin canister and pulls out a dripping, wet sponge. He presses it firmly over his nose and mouth, squinting through the stinging fumes as he weaves through the crowded marketplace. In the Middle Ages, people believed that foul smells weren't just gross, they were deadly. They thought bad air or miasma carried the plague straight into your blood. But here's the strange part. This merchant isn't just using a wet rag. That sponge is soaked in high-strength vinegar and crushed herbs. He believes he's creating a chemical shield that scrubs the corruption out of every breath he takes. And then it gets worse for those who can't afford fancy sponges. In the same market, a poor laborer covers his face with a handful of bitter-smelling wormwood just to walk past an open sewer. What happened next was unexpected, though. While the vinegar didn't actually stop the plague, it did kill the fleas and lice that try to hop onto the merchant's face. Without realizing it, his smell shield was actually a primitive pesticide. But this wasn't the only way they fought the filth. While the merchant uses vinegar for his nose, a nearby surgeon is busy pouring a flask of acidic red wine into a soldier's open leg wound. The soldier grips a wooden bench, sweating as the wine hits the raw muscle. It looks like torture, but the acidity in the wine is doing something the local well water never could. It's sanitizing the injury. In a world where water was a death sentence, the sharpest smells and strongest liquids were the only things keeping people standing. Imagine a blood-stained field after a brutal skirmish. A village wise woman kneels in the grass, hovering over a soldier with a deep gash across his arm. Instead of reaching for a bucket of cool river water, she grabs a clay flask filled with strong, sour red wine. She tips the bottle, pouring the dark liquid directly into the open wound. The soldier hisses in pain, gripping the grass as the wine bubbles against his raw flesh. In the Middle Ages, washing a wound with water was often a death sentence. Streams were filled with hidden parasites that caused deadly infections. But here's the strange part. Medieval healers noticed that wine kept wounds from festering. They didn't know about bacteria, but the high acidity and alcohol in the wine acted like a primitive bleach. What happened next was even more intense. The woman takes a coarse rag, soaks it in the wine, and begins scrubbing the skin around the cut. She isn't being gentle. She is scouring away the dirt and grime. And then it gets worse for the patient. After the cleaning, she doesn't use a fresh bandage. She dips a clean linen cloth back into the wine and wraps it tight against the soldier's throbbing arm. It looks like a waste of good drink, but this was the highest level of medical technology available. While the local well water was crawling with invisible killers, the fermented grapes were actually sanitizing the injury. The acidity created an environment where germs simply couldn't survive, turning a common dinner drink into a lifesaver on the battlefield. Without realizing it, these healers were practicing advanced chemistry centuries before the microscope was even invented. Imagine a monk in a coarse brown habit standing in a dark, stone-lined cellar. He lifts a heavy bucket and pours thick, cloudy river water into a large ceramic urn sitting on a wooden tripod. He doesn't stir it or boil it. He simply waits. Slowly, crystal-clear droplets begin to leak through the bottom of the solid clay pot, dripping one by one into a clean stone basin on the floor. In the mountain monasteries of the Middle Ages, monks were the ultimate survival engineers. While villagers drank straight from muddy streams, these monks used unglazed clay as a high-tech filter. But here's the strange part. The clay wasn't just a container. Its microscopic pores were so small that they physically trapped dirt, sand, and even some parasites that the naked eye couldn't see. What happened next was even more clever. To make the water even safer, the monks began layering the inside of these jars with crushed charcoal and fine sand. A monk would shovel a layer of black coal into the jar before pouring the water, creating a multi-stage cleaning system. It looked like a simple kitchen chore, but they were actually performing mechanical filtration centuries before modern plumbing existed. And then it gets worse for those living outside the monastery walls. While the monks enjoyed clear, filtered water in their cool cellars, the local peasants were still struggling with water that looked like soup. The monks kept these filtration secrets behind stone walls, turning their monasteries into the only places in the region where you could get a glass of water that wouldn't make your stomach turn. They were using the earth itself to scrub the water clean, proving that sometimes the best technology is just a very smart piece of dirt. Imagine a kitchen servant standing in the center of a bustling stone castle kitchen. He is leaning over a large wooden table, using a heavy stone pestle to crush piles of small, unripe green grapes. The air is filled with a sharp, mouth-puckering scent as he scoops up the sour juice and dumps it directly into a massive barrel of stored rainwater. In the Middle Ages, water sitting in a barrel would turn slimy and green within days. To stop this, cooks used verjuice, a liquid so acidic it could almost strip paint. But here's the strange part. They weren't trying to make a cocktail. They were actually changing the pH level of their entire water supply. This extreme acidity turned the barrel into a kill zone for many types of bacteria that would normally thrive in stagnant water. What happened next was unexpected for anyone tasting it for the first time. The water didn't taste like water anymore. It was sharp, tart, and refreshing. The servant would stir the barrel with a long paddle, ensuring the sour juice mixed thoroughly with the dregs at the bottom. By doing this, he was effectively pickling the water, keeping it shelf-stable for weeks while the castle was under siege or during a long summer heat wave. And then it gets worse for the bacteria trying to grow. While ordinary pond water would quickly become a soup of parasites, this verjuice spike supply remained clear and safe to drink. It was a simple trick of chemistry that allowed 1,000 people inside a castle to survive without a fresh spring. They used the power of unripe fruit to transform a bucket of rot into a reliable lifeline, proving that in the medieval world, being sour was the best way to stay healthy. Imagine a wealthy noblewoman standing in her sunlit manor bedroom, surrounded by heavy, traveling trunks. She picks up a decorative metal canteen and, before filling it with water, drops a single, high-purity silver coin into the flask. The coin makes a sharp clink against the bottom as she secures the leather strap for a week-long carriage journey. In the medieval world, water sitting in a canteen for days usually turned into a foul-smelling soup of slime. But the elite had a secret, high-tech weapon that the poor could never afford. They had realized that silver possessed a mysterious power to keep liquids fresh, even in the summer heat. But here's the strange part. They didn't know anything about bacteria or ions. They simply observed that while water in a wooden bucket rotted, water touching silver stayed odorless and clear. And then it gets worse for anyone drinking from cheap pewter or clay. While a commoner would suffer from stomach cramps after 3 days on the road, the noblewoman could sip from her silver-lined flask without fear. What happened next was unexpected, though. Travelers began to realize that just throwing a silver groat into a standard leather skin could save their lives. They were unknowingly using the oligodynamic effect, where tiny amounts of silver metal dissolve into the water and act as a natural, invisible disinfectant. She climbs into her carriage, knowing her water supply is safe behind a layer of precious metal. While the rest of the world struggled with murky, dangerous wells, the rich were using their wealth to literally sanitize their drinks. It wasn't just a show of status. It was a desperate, effective shield against the invisible killers lurking in every drop of medieval water. Imagine a village herbalist kneeling in a small garden patch behind her thatched hut. She holds a gnarled, dirty horseradish root and begins slicing it into jagged, pungent pieces with a rusted iron knife. The sharp smell fills the air as she drops the white chunks into a bucket of foul-smelling, green water she just pulled from a stagnant pond. In a medieval world, when the beer barrels ran dry and the wine was too expensive, the poor had to get creative to avoid a painful death. They relied on hot plants to purge their water of hidden killers. But here's the strange part. The herbalist didn't know about science, but she knew that the burning sting of the root meant it was working. Horseradish contains natural compounds that can actually paralyze and kill certain waterborne bacteria. What happened next was unexpected for the thirsty villagers. They would let the bucket sit for hours, watching as the heat from the root leaked into the murky liquid. And then it gets worse. The water would become so spicy and bitter that it was hard to swallow without gagging. However, drinking that bitter soup was the only thing that kept their guts from cramping up with cholera or dysentery. As the herbalist stirs the bucket with a wooden stick, she is essentially creating a botanical disinfectant. While a nobleman used silver and a monk used clay, the peasant used the burning roots from their own backyard. It was a desperate, stinging defense against the filth of the Middle Ages, proving that sometimes the only way to make water safe was to make it taste like fire.